Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, thank you for joining us this Friday evening. Stephen Lewis and Stephen Frampton. I wish you guys could have heard our pre-show chat. We were essentially doing the show before we got started, weren't we, Steve?
Yes, absolutely.
Preparing for all that we have on the agenda tonight. We're going to talk about the Ebola scare, first of all. After that, we're going to discuss the recent spate of juvenile violence, specifically talking about the schoolyard stabbing in Kentwood, Michigan, but also in Utah, there was homicide between brothers, and also in another part of the world, there was a sister who rose up. Illinois, that's it. So here, within a couple of days, Steve, we've had several adolescents, become homicidal. And in addition to that, we're going to try to check in and see what's in store for Israel and also Eastern Europe. We've just been having a morbid summer, haven't we, Steve?
It's been a very troublesome time, and almost to the extent that one loses track of everything that's going on. Whilst the conflict between Israel and Palestine was at its height, I think it's going to reach another height shortly, but the previous height, the world's attention seemed to be drawn away from Iraq and ISIS. So as I said, just so much going on, it's almost hard to keep track of, and there are things that are lower down on the list of headlines that under normal circumstances would be right at the top.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and especially now that the United States, if I'm not mistaken, has bombed ISIS targets on more than one occasion. I think they're going in for a second go at those guys. So maybe belatedly, maybe not. America is weighing in on this, and I really hope that they make some inroads. And while they're at it, it probably couldn't hurt to go ahead and get Bashar al-Assad out of there and establish something like real security. But we'll get to that in a bit. Let's start out first with something that is a huge phobic point for Westerners and really everyone, the threat of disease. It's been with us forever, the threat of the plague, ring around the rosies. What new plague songs are going to be coming out? Hopefully none with Ebola. It's a recent virus. Its first outbreak was in the 1976, late August 1976, and we're having another outbreak this time, Steve. It originated in Guinea, if I'm not mistaken. Shall we talk about Ebola?
Yes, absolutely. And then it spread to Liberia, and I think it was Sierra Leone, Stephen, if my memory serves me correctly. And there has been a case in Nigeria, which is the most populous state or nation in Africa. Then bear in mind that 2 American doctors that were working as missionaries have been brought back to the United States and are in quarantine. They've received this new experimental drug that hasn't been used before that seems to be helping, but we're still waiting to find out. And interestingly, I live in East Tennessee, Stephen. There's a gentleman in a town just an hour away from me who came back from Liberia and has quarantined himself
Wow.
in his home. He doesn't think that he has Ebola, but he has been in contact with people that did have it. So he's quarantined in his home. And then very worrying occurrence as well. Saudi Arabia had its first case of Ebola and a death. A gentleman that had flown back from, again, Liberia, I think. Also a priest, a Spanish priest, was taken back to Spain with Ebola. So it's very worrying.
Yes, it is, Steve, and it's showing a trajectory, I dare say, that's worsening. Now, I think that the overall fatality rate is dropping somewhat. However, fatalities themselves still continue to climb. The outbreak started, as far as I could tell, around the end of March 24th to March 25th. Certainly it was going on by then, but the World Health Organization reported on the outbreak of Ebola. And in fact, the local national health apparatus in Guinea made its announcement of the outbreak on that day, March the 25th, 2014. And, in order to track transits, fairly conveniently, I just use the election chart software module. That way, it has a clicker so I can switch between days and months and years really, really, really fast. And I use that function to sort of track the progress of Ebola over the past, ever since it appeared most recently in late March. And, with Jupiter in Cancer at that time, March the 24th, 2014, I cast that chart for Conakry, Guinea, which is I want to say it's the capital.
Mm-hmm.
We have Jupiter at 10 degrees Cancer in opposition to Pluto at 13 degrees Capricorn, and that's going to be significant. As far as I'm concerned, Jupiter in Cancer is not what you want to see in an epidemic sort of situation anyway. But even more disturbing is the applying conjunction between the Sun and Uranus in Aries. That is not going to be good, especially as it moves to an opposition. The Sun moves to oppose Mars later. So March 24th, we have that announcement of that outbreak. By the time the end of March gets here, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta sends out a 5-man team to Southeast Guinea on March the 31st. And by this time, the Sun has gotten much closer in its conjunction to Uranus, and Jupiter is still in Cancer, of course. But as we get to the 23rd of April, where the fatalities by now have reached 142 dead out of 242 confirmed cases, then a lot of really frightening planetary pictures emerge. Venus is in a trine. A lot of really nice aspects. Venus is in a trine with Jupiter, in a trine with Saturn. Jupiter is also in a trine with Saturn and in a trine with Neptune. And so as far as I'm concerned, all of these trines are really facilitating the communicability of the illness. And by the time we get a month later, boom, the Ebola has spread to the capital, Conakry. And by this time, the Sun is squaring Mars, and there's greater national fear and awareness as the capital becomes involved here. And by the 15th of June, now all of a sudden, Ebola is in Liberia, and the Sun is trying the nodal axis. It's trying the north node and sextile the south node. Jupiter's in the bends at this point. And so people are getting scared by the 15th of June. Moving on to the end of June, the situations described by Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, out of control, they call it, totally out of control by June 30th. The Sun has recently ingressed into Cancer. Mercury's trining the nodal axis. The Sun's square Uranus. So all of these planetary pictures are now getting darker until finally Liberia closes its borders at the end of July. Mars, by this point, ingresses into Scorpio. And, looking at these charts, there's an emphasis on the water signs and on Scorpio, and the situation just gets worse. And it's really going to be interesting to see how it evolves in the future, Steve.
I think it's very worrying. Looking at Guinea, Stephen, the picture's pretty grim, and I don't feel that they've seen the worst of it yet. We know that the problem in these nations in Africa is that they're not really equipped, and they don't have the infrastructure to manage an outbreak well. So, for example, the gentleman, the medic, the American medic who was brought back to Atlanta, he's in isolation, he's receiving great treatment, and there's a very strict protocol for caring for a person, treating a person that has such a dreadful and infectious disease. But that's not the case in Africa. If you look at the images in the media, you're looking at people who are in tents, hospitals that are tents, and there's just huge risk. And as I said before, we know that there is now a case of a gentleman that died in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, I think. But looking at the outlook for Guinea alone, we've got, when we look at the progressions, those deep underlying aspects or circumstances, we've got a square, an obstacle between the sun, the essence of Guinea, and Pluto. Pluto is the modern planet of death, and at the same time there's a contraparallel aspect between the sun and Pluto. So a really intense situation there. The other thing, Stephen, is you were talking about Uranus, and I could see in Guinea's chart that Uranus is creeping its way up to the south node of the moon in Guinea's chart. That is that's serious. That's a big problem. You know, having such a slow-moving planet moving its way up to and over the south node of the moon, right. That's very, very challenging. So I know that we're saying, or the media, in the media, the word is that there are lots of efforts to contain Ebola, but whilst that might be the case, we haven't seen the worst of this in Guinea, certainly, looking at their chart.
It's really scary to me, especially when you consider the involvement of Europe and other places in the developed world in treating this illness, which is, I applaud for sure the heroism, because a lot of the health workers are infected by Ebola, and a lot, as we've seen with the paramedic you mentioned, and also with the Spanish priest, Father Pajares. He's also struggling for life right now. So, it's the people who are trying to contain the situation and aid the Africans who are really suffering here.
Amazingly brave.
Also, in addition, of course, to the natives.
Yeah, and these are incredible people that have gone and placed themselves at risk in order to help other people, which I think is admirable. What saddens me, Stephen, is that the discussion about this new drug that may really help people with Ebola, this discussion kicked off when Westerners started to become affected by Ebola. We didn't hear much discussion about it when it was just people in Africa dying of Ebola, but now a couple of Westerners have contracted Ebola. We're talking about this new drug that could be made available, but it really upsets me that discussion wasn't taking place earlier to help people in Africa. And the other thing, Stephen, is I often feel saddened by this kind of situation, because, again, if it wasn't for the risk presented to the West,
right,
there wouldn't be as much focus on this. And that's what really saddens me, because I don't care if a person's in Africa, in the North Pole, in North Wales. A person is a person. A human being is a human being. We're all equal. And these issues really sort of become very noticeable at times like this. But very interesting to look at the World Health Organization chart, Stephen, and you identified the information for that chart. I appreciate you getting hold of that.
Sure.
But that's got some very interesting dynamics in it as well. And I think the World Health Organization today, I'll check, but I think that they announce an international emergency for Ebola.
Yes, this was. I think this was also a formality, a necessary precursor to dispensing more funds or a higher or more involved level of support. Do you see? So, but for sure, it's definitely significant. And I just want to say also that I definitely feel where you're coming from about the aspects of inequality. They cannot be ignored with this disease, because the practicalities of the situation are this. If you're not going, are you going to wash your hands after going number 1 or number 2 or even numbers 3 and 4 if there's a shortage of water?
Yeah.
So there's a problem. The problem, I think, there's a linkage between availability or lack thereof of resources and the communicability of the disease. Now, my point here is that we're at the very end of a period of about, I want to say about 240 years or so, and about 240 years, where the great Jupiter-Saturn conjunction occurs in one single element. Right, that's a cycle. It's a repetition of. It's a larger cycle. The cycle itself is the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. The idea of expansion coupled with contraction.
Yeah.
And for the past 240 years or so, roughly, it's been in Earth signs. Every time, Jupiter, the faster-moving planet, conjuncts Saturn and moves to the sextile, to the square, to the trine, finally to oppose Saturn, and then coming back in with a square and a sextile, and finally conjuncting him again. Whipping through that cycle over and over again the past 240 years, every time in Earth signs, but when it's about to conclude, either the next cycle or the cycle after that, it's about to shift into air signs. Is what I'm trying to say, and this is going to be significant.
Well, yes, because I know that Ebola is not airborne, but when it comes to an illness, the thought of the astrological dynamic shifting from Earth to air is worrying, isn't it?
It's obviously problematic in terms of communicability because, in addition to the obvious analogy of transmission through the air and respiration, there's also the idea of transmission through any kind of human contact or commerce. But also significantly about this shift of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle into the air element is that it's going to bring in to bear notions of equality, fairness, all of those lofty ideas represented by the air element, equal treatment for all men and women.
Yes.
I
think you raise a really important point, Stephen, and I think, when we talk about the air element, we're not suggesting that to our listeners that Ebola is airborne, because we know it's not. It's transmitted through bodily fluids. But I think that the theme of us having to think about these problems as global problems, that's something that comes to my mind. But also, Stephen, you mentioned the situation with water, the availability of water, etc. It would be nice if we lived in a world in which we said, do you know what, anybody on our planet that doesn't have access to water, that's dreadful, let's fix it. Let's make decisions to just fix these things that shouldn't be occurring in this day and age. But you think of the fact that we now live in a time in which you can hop on a plane and you can be in Africa or anywhere in the world the next day, pretty much. And so the fact that people don't have a good infrastructure, or don't have clean water, that is a risk for the whole planet.
Also, yeah.
This is the global age, and as I said, sadly, you'd think that we'd just come to the conclusion that these are global problems because human beings are involved. It seems to be that we're coming to these conclusions because we realise that the West is also at risk. But anyway, it's important to recognise that somebody not having water, not having a good infrastructure in Africa, it is a problem for us all, because this kind of dreadful disease can spread.
Yes, it can. It can and will spread. And I tell you what, I think that as the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction moves into the air element, I think we're also going to see the big conflict's going to be between, who do we let into our countries this day and age? Because communicable diseases that are lethal are likely to be a much bigger bullet point on the global agenda during that time. Do you see? So we have Saturn in the air signs that's going to, at some point, perhaps want to reject rights. and contrasted with Jupiter, that's in the air sign, that's going to want to expand the right, or it's going to be more philosophical about the issue, where versus Saturn's practicality. And so I'm thinking the immigration question, especially as it pertains to the outbreak of epidemics and the communicability of diseases, I think once this great Jupiter-Saturn conjunction moves into the air element, I think we're liable to see the conflict revolving around those issues, Steve. Really, in other words, I'm not saying that when this cycle moves into the air signs that it's going to represent a panacea and a cure-all for inequalities in Africa, especially as regards the way the West treats Africa and its both human and material resources. I really think that the inequalities are going to shift away from the use of Africa's resources and more to the idea of integrating Africans into the global community through immigration policies. But that's speculation. You know what I'm saying, Steve?
Yeah, and as well today that there's been a statement that the U.S. will not see an Ebola outbreak. So Tom Frieden, he leads the U.S. Infectious Disease Agency. He made a statement to a congressional panel stating that it's not likely that there would be a problem in the United States and that we're equipped to deal with Ebola. But I think we only have 4 facilities that can actually quarantine a person and treat them in the USA. But I think that the risk is significant because it only takes a person that's gone to Africa on a business trip, that's flown back and gone home, interacted with their family and their friends and their colleagues, not realizing that they're sick. Because bear in mind, Ebola has a 21-day incubation period. It only takes something like that for many people potentially to be affected. So I feel a little bit concerned by these bold statements that it's unlikely there would be a problem in the U.S. and that we're equipped to handle it, etc.
Yeah, that comment was certainly premature. It was troubling. It was brash, even, I dare say, because, Steve, I'm no microbiologist, but to my thinking, it would be child's play to aerosolize this pathogen, to militarize this pathogen.
Yes, and Stephen, you make a chilling point, because which is the country today that declared a national emergency related to Ebola? Nigeria. Which is the country that has this dreadful terrorist organization that makes Al-Qaeda look like a tea party, tromping around, kidnapping young girls, slaughtering people? Which nation? Nigeria. It's chilling.
It is chilling. So we need to take it seriously, and for sure. And to that end, the World Health Organization is going to ponder the ethical question of deploying experimental vaccines, medicines, and things of that sort.
Yeah, well, somebody in Nigeria has already been given this new experimental drug. It's been used already. I'm not sure if it's today or yesterday, but it's been used. But Stephen, can we talk a little bit about this World Health Organization chart?
Sure.
Because I looked at it, and the first thing that struck me again, and I know I harp on about this, but the first thing that struck me again is that the south node in this chart, the progressed south node, is at 12 degrees Scorpio, that very spot that we said is problematic in Israel and Palestine's chart. So it doesn't mean that the same things occur, because obviously this is an organization, not a nation, and they're different entities. But it means that eclipse that's being triggered right now and in the next week or two by Mars, it's at the south node of the World Health Organization. That's extremely unfortunate. I'm not saying that Ebola is going to destroy humanity, but there are certainly huge challenges for the World Health Organization, whatever they may be, because an eclipse at the south node is rough, really rough.
This is a perfect example of how mundane astrology describes the way that various different collectives, various distinct pockets of masses, nations in other words, how they respond to the same pressures. The World Health Organization emerged out of the same era as, for example, the State of Israel.
Yes.
You know, we have Saturn in Leo, Mars also in Leo, Pluto in Leo. These are all signatures of the Israeli natal figure. We have the South Node in Scorpio. Scorpio is accentuated in Israeli figure. We have Jupiter in Sagittarius. Jupiter occupies Sagittarius in the Israeli natal figure. So the idea here is that
Scorpio rules death.
Well, is it any coincidence, Steve, that Israel is also going through a challenging period now? Their charts are very similar. They emerged out of the same hierarchy of larger planetary cycles. The charts have similarities in the collective organization of archetypes. You see, so the collective, both of the charts for the chart for the World Health Organization and for the nation of Israel, both of these charts represent a collective energy that was important to the entire globe. You know, the emergence of the State of Israel and the emergence of the World Health Organization are both related to yet a larger overarching event, World War II, and the destruction of Europe and the reorganization of that entire continent, and ditto Asia. You see, so it's really, this is what humbles me as a spiritualist, is to understand and grasp at how the larger cycles interrelate with each other and link various entities that we might not recognize, because I tell you, it's no coincidence that Israel is also going through a period of testing and tribulation as well, because it's cut from the same sort of cosmological cloth as the World Health Organization, interestingly enough. Yeah.
It's extremely interesting. Looking at the WHO chart and looking at progressions, well, the eclipse that we discussed, that we mentioned, indicates challenges for the World Health Organization, but looking at the major progressed aspects, these deep pockets of energy that get triggered at certain points in time, the particularly challenging times look to be 2015, 2016.
Well, as far as Ebola is concerned and forecasting the progression of the disease, I'm kind of at a loss there. I've spent most of my research time looking into the past behavior of not just this outbreak, but other outbreaks dating back to 1976. You know, my goal is to get a handle on the long-term behavior of this biological cycle, this outgrowth and this outgrowth of Ebola. There's a cycle to that as well. That's the beautiful thing about astrology and modern science, is that modern scientists are beginning to acknowledge the primacy of cycles in general. You see, and so the biological cycle that is Ebola, it pays to study that as a whole. And so right now my research is that I can't say what it's going to do.
Well, we did also say that for our book we will do a very thorough analysis of the planetary cycles. So that's as they cycle across the equator when a new cycle begins. So we would look at each planet and consider the cycle for each planet and look at whether there are points in time that there are particular risks that come together. So that's a big piece of work. It's a piece of work that I know we'll do. But even just looking at the World Health Organization's progress chart, you know, you or look at the natal chart, you see that cluster of Mars, the minor malefic, Saturn, the major malefic, and then Pluto, which is a very transformational and profound, often problematic planet. They're all clustered together there in a triple conjunction, and Saturn has progressed and is now conjunct Mars, that's a problematic combination of planets. And so the pressure is on right now, because even today the Sun is conjunct that very conjunction of Saturn and Mars, and Jupiter's moving up to that point. So I feel that there are some very challenging times for the WHO, and the south node of the moon is also transiting down towards the natal sun. So they're going to have some huge challenges on their hands. But you're right, we need to do an analysis of the planetary cycles, just generally speaking, universally, and not just in the context of an entity or a number of entities like the WHO.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious, because I want to get a handle on how the cycle is going to behave over the coming decades and maybe even centuries. Astrology easily permits us to engage in a research project of that magnitude, Steve. And interestingly, there, in looking to time any pressure points for the WHO, the World Health Organization, I noticed you mentioned that progressed Saturn is conjuncting the natal Mars.
Yeah, and that peaks in 2016, beginning of March 2016.
Well, just when, for example, during the right now, I want to say Saturn's at 16 Scorpio. Let me double check that. And yes, Saturn is at 16 degrees 56 minutes of Scorpio. So he's squaring that natal Saturn. That indeed, he's squaring the entire transiting Saturn is squaring that entire natal stellium in Leo. And
he's conjunct the south node already with the eclipse that's about to be triggered as well.
So for timing things out, I would want to say, hey, wow, I think when the square with Mars becomes exact, when transiting Saturn reaches 18 degrees 34 minutes of Scorpio and exactly squares the Mars and squares the progressed, his own progressed place, I think that should be significant. And as always, the progressed moon is a critical timing factor, and just the moon's normal motion is let's not forget, is always a very important timing factor as well. The moon cycle with the sun is perhaps the most basic and most famous, and maybe even arguably the most important planetary cycle of them all. It's quite swift too, so it's valuable in that regard as a timing device, as the second hand on our cosmic clock, as it were. So also, it's interesting to superimpose the chart for the very first Ebola outbreak that occurred August 26, 1976, and that was in I cast this chart for the city of Lasala in Zaire, today the modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo. And incidentally, for those who don't know, the chart for the World Health Organization's Constitution ratification, I cast that for April the 7th, 1948, for Geneva, Switzerland. We don't really have a time for that, so I just put in a noon time. I would love to rectify that, and we'll probably announce the rectified time later, but for now I'll just put noon. Anyway, comparing that with the chart of the first Ebola outbreak, August 26, 1976, for Lasala in Zaire, Saturn at that point was at 10 degrees Leo, and that means that the World Health Organization was about to experience a Saturn return. Its first Saturn return, probably. Yeah, its first Saturn return, which represents a radical reappraisal of the World Health Organization's mission statement. It's sort of like, okay, you've had a cycle to learn the lesson. Now it's time to put into practice what you've learned. Now it's time for God or the universe or whatever to test you on what you've learned. And that coincided with the first Ebola outbreak. And so this is a major. I think the behavior of this disease is sort of like the Apollo Creed to the World Health Organization's Rocky Balboa. You know what I mean? It's sort of like the archetypal villain. It's tied into the World Health Organization's natal astrological dynamics, and it's very important.
The one of the two people that, I think it was two people co-discovered the virus back in '76, and one of them is Peter Piot. I'm not sure if that's how his last name is pronounced or should be pronounced, but it's Piot, and he made a statement about the use of experimental drugs, and his statement was, it's highly likely that if Ebola were now spreading in Western countries, public health authorities would give at-risk patients access to experimental drugs or vaccines. That's another way of saying, why aren't we doing that for the people that are affected by Ebola in Africa right now?
Right.
You know, something gets done when it becomes a problem for the West.
Yeah, it's sad, but you know, with a disease like Ebola, it doesn't take long to come to the attention of the West, because its symptoms are quite dramatic and noticeable, and B, in this modern era of international communication and travel, it's quite easy for, especially, you know, in the UK, in America, which have substantial African immigrant populations and have for, you know, a few generations now. It's going to become more and more important. And you know, Africa is the incubator for some of civilization's thorniest diseases. HIV emerged out of Africa through the interaction of native hunters and the bushmeat that they killed, the various monkeys. You know, it evolved from a simian autoimmune disease to a hominoid, a human autoimmune disease, and you know, over the course of centuries, and you know, over the course of years, the disease evolved, and until the 80s, when people speculate some cheerfully ignorant flight steward, you know, went around sort of carelessly fornicating and spreading around the modern scourge, human immunodeficiency virus. So Africa is very curious and interesting in its function as an incubator for, you know, God's version of the lethal injection chamber. You know, the things that I suppose the religious oriented might say that God might use to punish mankind, or the ecologically sensitive might put it as Mother Nature using to, you know, punish man. One of the quivers in her sheath of arrows, as it were. Africa seems to be the laboratory for Mother Nature's way of both A, mutating and evolving and experimenting with microbes, and B, disseminating them to humans. It's very interesting.
I was going to make a really important point, Stephen, and I'm frustrated because I've forgotten what it was. You just have something really important to say, and then you forget. Oh, actually, I don't remember now what it is. One of the things we need to do, or I think the answer to the question you were debating before, is in our analysis for the book, we need to basically identify the world's worst epidemics, worst pandemics, and so we look at the Great Plague, for example, and Spanish flu, and situations like that, and look at what was going on astrologically so that we can be clear what the astrological markers are, and then we can actually look forward in time and see if those markers are replicated or when those markers are replicated, so that we can identify when in the future there would be significant public health tragedies, problems like the plague or something on that scale. So that's a piece of work we can do.
You're right. It's important work as well, and it's good to be able to systematically apply a method to this sort of research. And it's true. You know, we expect that the research is ongoing, but we expect that some of the same offenders are likely to show their faces in outbreaks of the bubonic plague and the Spanish flu and other epidemics. We expect the same offenders to be active in future epidemic cycles. Personally, I'm curious about the big one. The one that's going to threaten um, humanity globally, and that of course raises the question of how much free will we can exert to escape to escape the cycle. And wow, I've said it once and I've said it again. It's certainly not my idea. Quoting, I don't know the page number, but I got it from this book called Mundane Astrology by Michael Bagant, Charles Harvey, and Nicholas Campion. Sort of a standard text on this sort of stuff. And in that book, they say they relate the concept that it's easier to make predictions for the masses because the masses are more fated than the individual is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's harder for the collective to exert any sort of quote unquote free will. It's hard for in other words, if we're dealing with something that's a cycle, something that in theory has the power of a lunar of the tide, you know what I mean? I mean, how in the hell do you stop the oceans from receding and swelling with the tides? How do you sidestep a cycle? That's the question.
It brings you back to the reminder that we are at the mercy of Mother Nature. We think that we're invincible. We're not at all. And it takes a good strong tidal wave or tornado, and we think that we fully occupy and master this planet that we're living on, that we're highly conscious, more highly conscious than anything else. And there are theories that planets are actually far more evolved in their consciousness than human beings.
Yes, it's true. But I think, the problem is that now we're dealing with karma that we've sown, as evidenced by Jupiter and Saturn's cycles through the Earth sign. During that 240-year period, we've lived irresponsibly. We've used up resources wastefully and without regards to future generations. We've exploited those weaker than ourselves, and we've done. You see, this is the cycle of Jupiter and Saturn, the licentiousness of Jupiter versus the asceticism and piousness of Saturn, sort of a situation. And now once this cycle transitions to the air signs, then we're going to have to deal, instead of with resources, we're going to be dealing with, again, the human consequences of our mistakes, the thorny diplomatic issues, as the people of Africa become more and more conscious of the gulf between themselves and the rest of the world's wealth. Do you see? So I see that transition of Jupiter and Saturn's cycle into the air sign as being highly significant. We can't dismiss the relationship between resources, as signified by the cycle, Jupiter-Saturn cycle going through the Earth element, resources to this disease. The contours of an Ebola outbreak would look quite different if it happened, for example, in Cape Town or Philadelphia, God forbid. It would look quite different because people in these places have different capabilities and concepts of sanitation and hygiene. It would be, now, Ebola by its nature is tenacious. Anybody looking at the foundation chart of the outbreaks for this disease will see how tenacious it is, with the Sun and Aries for the chart of the first. Excuse me. I'm sorry, for the Aries and Leo, fire signs, in other words, are accentuated. Let me go ahead and pull up the chart for the first outbreak. Again, that was in August of 1976.
Which day was it?
It was August the 26th.
1976.
1976, yeah, I said that. Okay.
And where was that?
Here we go. I can't pronounce the word without looking at it. Lisala, Lisala, in the country of. Your software will either have it as Zaire or Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the two. And
I found it.
Okay. Yeah, so we have Neptune and Sagittarius. which, to my mind, Sagittarius representing flights in airplanes, is a sort of blunt symbol for pathogens distributed through airplanes. So that, as far as I'm concerned, constitutes a warning right there.
Yeah, Mars is in air, isn't it? Mars rules infections.
Right.
Saturn's in the bends.
Right. So the chart for this is fairly nasty. Saturn is in the fire sign of Leo at the 10th degree, and Leo's hot. Leo's feverish, and interesting to look at the stellium in Virgo of the Sun, Moon, and Venus. Virgo representing sort of the lush, tropical nature of Africa. Virgo is definitely the earthiest of earthy signs, just about. In the sense, it's the most lush of earthy signs. Capricorn is rocky and craggy. Taurus is also kind of hilly, but Virgo is lush, it's cultivated, and
she rules the harvest, doesn't she?
That she does. And to have that stellium there, the people are there, the moon is there, Venus is there as well. So it shows as far as I'm concerned, the impact. The ruler of the stellium in Libra, as far as I'm concerned, speaks a bit to the communicability of the disease, and conjunct Mars as it is, and conjuncting Pluto too, shows sort of the febrile nature of the disease, the hemorrhagic characteristics of it. So it's really nasty, and it resonates to, as far as my research is revealing, it resonates to a variety of cycles, not just the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, but also the Saturn-Neptune cycle. And as our research continues in this vein, we'll examine this. We'll examine Ebola in the context of more and more planetary cycles until a gestalt emerges, an overview. It's a fascinating exercise to undertake, Steve.
It is. We just need to make the time to do all of these analyses, and I know we've got time booked out in the fall.
Right.
That really, you could spend years just doing nothing other than this kind of research, but we have to make a living as well. Should we talk, Stephen, about this terrible stabbing, this young boy who stabbed another young boy in a playground?
By all means.
This week.
By all means, young Jamarion Lawhorn stabbed little Connor Verkerka, if I pronounced his name properly. If I didn't, please forgive me. And the lad made it back to his house, supported by his kid brother. And man, it just breaks your heart. And it makes you angry to think about the offense. But then when you consider the other pole, that the assailant, the offender, is a 12-year-old kid, himself undoubtedly doomed psychologically, and your heart just breaks even more. And
he actually asked for the police to come and kill him.
Yeah. What could be more heartbreaking than a suicidal 12-year-old kid? Now, without access to the child's natal chart, I can't say whether or not he was, what's the word I'm looking for, dissimulating. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we people, just for everyone's reference, we don't have a chart yet for this boy or the victim. No. We haven't identified their birth data yet.
No, we don't. But you know what? I have to say that horary has long been a vital tool in mundane analysis. I like to point out that the Christian church is biased toward astrology. Puzzlingly enough, did not traditionally include mundane astrology. Mundane was considered, quote-unquote, natural astrology, whereas electional astrology, horary, the other branches were considered divinatory, quote-unquote, judicial astrology. This was kind of a no-no. This made the Christians uncomfortable. But mundane astrology, they saw this as holy, as sacred. St. Thomas Aquinas himself has a lot to say about it, as do other Christian scholars. So
when it was outlawed, the Pope was the only person allowed to consult astrology or astrologers.
Oh, sure. And up until that point, there had been many a Pope who consulted with astrologers to see if they would become Pope. So astrology emerged out of a tradition wherein studying it was as simple as enrolling in the nearest university, which of course wasn't that simple. But can you imagine being able to go to Harvard or Princeton and signing up for a major in astrology, not just a course, but a major, with all the world's astrological authorities, Robert Hand, Noel Tile, Robert Zoll, all of the.
Wow. Maybe that's one of the things we have to bring back at some point. We have to make that happen again, because that would be amazing. And I think that metaphysical tools, great tools, proven tools like astrology, should be taught in schools.
Oh yeah, and it will, Steve. I mean, again, in accordance with the cyclical nature of all things, astrology and esoteric tools will again be accorded more respect from politicians, society in general, in the West, not just in the East.
Yep.
Which already respects astrology a great deal at all levels of society. So that will definitely that'll definitely happen now.
Stephen, you know that a member of Parliament, David Treadnick, in British Parliament, he spoke up last week in favour of using astrology in the national healthcare system in Britain. And so I sent him an email saying I was so pleased that he spoke up, and I've sent him a copy of my book on rampage killings and the use of metaphysical insight, specifically astrology in that case, to determine the level of risk in individuals and also calculate when the risk is heightened. So there are people that are speaking up. Sadly, he was very much ridiculed online and in the media. So there are people that are ready to speak up, but the masses are still uneducated when it comes to metaphysics, and I think that's why our show is important, because we're proving that metaphysical analysis is extremely accurate and extremely valid. But going back to this young boy that stabbed the other kid, we don't have his information yet, but we can look at the charts for Kentwood, Michigan, at the time of the stabbing, right?
Absolutely we can, Steve. I have that chart set for August the 4th, 2014, and I set it for around 4:10 in the afternoon, Steve. I don't know when the event happened, but I'm sort of using my detective spidey senses here to reason that, based upon the citizens, the witnesses' testimony that Jamarion came to his house and he assumed that the kid wanted to call his folks to pick him up. Combine that with the idea that the playground in question was a private neighborhood playground and not a school playground. I'm thinking an after-school scenario, 4:10, 4 o'clock, 4:15, 4:33, 45-ish.
Sounds about right.
Right around in that range, you're going to have a pretty nasty configuration of planets, and I think that's right around the 12th house. Let me go ahead and pull that chart up in a format.
You said earlier in our discussion before the show that the Saturn and the Moon were in Scorpio in the 12th house around at that time.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunate. I noticed that transiting Pluto, modern planets of death, was in opposition to the transiting part of death, to the part of death in this chart.
Now, we can't, unfortunately, that would be a good way to rectify this chart using the Arabic parts, because they rely so much on the intermediate house cusps and the ascendants and things like that. So, using the part of death, we could rectify the ascendant going at it from that way. You know what I noticed though, Steve? You're sort of relating this, the sign of the time, the general atmosphere, relating it to another event on the world stage. In the solar return chart for Israel, this same configuration is occurring. The Moon and Saturn are in a water sign. Let me pull up the.
What's the time you have for the solar return for Israel?
Well, see, that time is calculated differently each year because it's the time that the sun returns to its exact natal position.
Yes.
And so most software modules, they'll actually do that for you. The time I have is 3:42:59 p.m. on May the 14th, 2014, set for Tel Aviv. And we have in that chart, this is a solar return chart, I have Saturn at 19 Scorpio and the moon at 20 Scorpio. Now this means that forecasting the entire year for Israel, if I do a lunar return to do a month-by-month blowdown of what's going to happen for Israel, I'm going to do it based on this chart, not Israel's natal chart. In other words, I'm going to do it every month when the moon returns to 20 degrees 42 minutes of Scorpio, not Israel's natal moon configuration, but where that spot it occupies in the solar return chart. And it's very interesting that degree pairing is.
Yes.
It's very much. You see,
it's a nasty chart. This is a nasty chart, Stephen.
Yeah, it is. It's really, and you can imagine that as the mundane houses are cycling around the earth throughout the day. In other words, as the day progresses, a lot of people are going to be in a funk on that day. Not just Jamarian, but he is, as we say in the business, he's riding the mundane wave in a major. And he's not the only one. There's those kids in Utah, those kids in the Chicago suburbs. So juvenile homicide is peaking right now. That's why. So at any rate, these kids, these children of the corn kids, they're riding the mundane wave. If we had access to their mundane charts, I'm pretty sure we'd find Moon in a water sign, or maybe even Moon and Saturn near this sensitive degree area of 19 to 20 degrees in the fixed sign or in the water signs, or maybe even in Scorpio. There will be something about their natal chart that mirrors this mundane snapshot of the terrible day that Jamarian Lawhorn stabbed little Connor Verkerke in the back. There's something about that day.
It's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. And so, playing around with the times on that, having that grouping of the Saturn and Moon in Scorpio, having that fall in the 12th house could probably be significant as far as time is concerned. Let me pull that up in my little electional chart module here so that I can play around with the time conveniently.
And while you do that, it's interesting that Mars rules violence, and it certainly rules knives.
Right.
Even the glyph for Mars looks quite like a knife. In the mundane chart for Kentwood, Michigan.
Right, yeah.
It said we chose 4:10 p.m., but this wouldn't change in an hour or two anyway. Mars is actually forming a challenging aspect to Jupiter, and that's within 1 degree, a square within 1 degree. So that's unfortunate. And then also we've got Mars squaring Mercury. In fact, Mercury and Jupiter were conjunct, and Mars was squaring that conjunction.
Yeah, and Mars in Scorpio is kind. It can be a problem. Scorpio is probably going to be a bit vengeful. You know what I mean? And Jupiter is the ascendant ruler of this tentative ascendant in Sagittarius. It's at 4:10 p.m. in Kentwood, Michigan. And he's also, by Alcibiades signs, in the 8th house of death. So to have Mars at 4:10 p.m. conjunct the 12th house and also squaring Jupiter in the 8th house of death, which is the ascendant ruler, that's a pretty negative combination.
Yeah, you've also got the ruler of the North Node, Venus, in the bends.
Absolutely. This is going to render it very public. Venus.
Oh, actually, Stephen, I really just noticed as well that Uranus, rebellion, revolt, sudden, is at the South Node.
Right, Uranus is
in Aries, which is one of the signs ruled by Mars.
Absolutely. Look where the nodal axis is at. In the 5th house of recreational places, the South Node is.
A park.
So the pictures the picture's all falling together now. You know,
the more you look at it, the more it just falls into place. And we've even got Mars in the house of the community, the 11th.
Right, very close to the 12th house cusp. So it's like Mars has a foot in one house and the other foot in the other house, and so it's nasty. And at 4:10 p.m., you know, I'm not saying the murder occurred then, but certainly, the crock pot was a bubbling. That's all we can say. All the ingredients were there, and everything was ready for a nasty event to happen. And it was localized to Kentwood, Michigan, by this ascendant rising. Okay, the house overlay is what localizes all of this stuff to Kentwood, Michigan itself.
It's amazing how much information is available through astrology. I remember when I wrote my book about the mass shooting in Aurora, Colorado, I can't remember whether it was in the event chart or in James Holmes's chart, asteroid Aurora was at the midheaven. In other words, what comes to the world's attention, what hits the headlines, well, anything at the midheaven, and Aurora itself, the asteroid, was right there at that very moment of the shooting. Yeah,
I know. It's things like that just really make, I don't want to say they make you smile because we're talking about a tragedy here, but from the perspective of time and distance, and it really makes studying astrology really interesting when we have these nice little synchronicities like that, like the asteroid Aurora conjunct the midheaven at the time of a significant event.
Even the victims' names were in really challenging and eerie places in the chart, Stephen. It's as though the heavens were even giving it the names of the people that would be killed. It's just unbelievable. But it brings up a very quick and easy debate about the word coincidence, because we use the word coincidence with the meaning or the connotation of something just happening per chance. But I don't think that's the true root of the word, because the root of it, the verb is to coincide. Two things coincide, two things occur together, but I don't feel that the word or the language originally necessarily was meant to give the flavor of something happening by chance. Because when you study metaphysics as we do, and when you do this for a living, you realize that there isn't much chance, or is there any chance? I'm not sure there is.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the medieval nomenclature for everything that ever happens to you is an accident. That's what they call you studying to graduate from college diligently for 4 years, an accident. You might protest hotly. It's not an accident. I busted my butt. It doesn't matter. The technical jargon for all the events that happen to us are accidents. Now, very, very deftly, you pointed out the etymology of coincidence. You're exactly right. The notion of polarity and relationship is written right there on the tin, and the prefix co. So we can think of the term coincidence as the same level of meaning as, for example, co-parenting, or coordinate, or cooperate, in the sense of two or even more entities producing a concerted effort, right, to parent or to operate or to whatever coing we're doing. Well, in this instance, we're coinciding. We're existing in a relationship together. Myself and this lottery win. We're existing together at this moment in time. There's nothing spontaneous necessarily or accidental about it that's written into the word. It's a cunning illusion affected by sort of a modern linguistic distortion.
Well, we'll have to go back, Stephen, to these boys' charts and this whole question of things coinciding. So when the information is available, we have to come back and look at their charts. What I find really interesting about this kind of event is that when you look at the dynamics in one chart and you can see the astrological configurations that describe what happened in that moment, then when you add the other person's chart to the picture, or you bring the charts together, you see that the occurrence is present in both charts, and you can see that the impact is it merges at the same point or points in the charts. So in other words, what might cause in your chart to lose the plot and hurt somebody, if I were on the receiving end of it, that very spot in your chart would be conjunct the descriptors of me being on the receiving end of your violence in my chart. Like the fact that the asteroid Aurora was at the midheaven when James Holmes went into the cinema and mowed down a bunch of people. So looking at synastry, bringing charts together, as we've done with, for example, Israel and Palestine and Iraq and ISIS, or IS as they're now known, and Ukraine and Russia and Putin in Ukraine and the plane that went down, MH17, and Putin's chart, those comparisons show you even more clearly how our paths are intertwined.
Absolutely. Is it coincidence that when I cast a horary chart for the question of why did Jamarian Lawhorn kill Connor, is it coincidence that the moon at the time of that horary question was in a sextile to the Saturn of that event chart? That, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Is it a coincidence that the horary chart I cast on that question is very, very telling? That the Saturn in Scorpio, that's been the subject of what we've been talking about here as far as the source of the badness in the stabbing chart. Is it a coincidence that Saturn is on the midheaven of my horary chart? I don't think that is a coincidence. So the idea is that this horary chart that I cast is very telling, more than likely, about the motives of Jamarian Lawhorn, and these will be validated as time passes. Looking at the event chart for the stabbing, we can also see that Jamarian's mental state is going, and motivation will be symbolized in this chart as well. The Saturn conjunct the moon is a classic symbol for severe depression, and when you have that in Scorpio, man, oh man, this is one disturbed little dude. This is one disturbed guy. It's square the sun of that event chart. So, this gives a picture of the tumultuous emotional landscape going on inside of him. Scorpio is all about vengeance and getting back. As far as we know, this is Jamarian's way of exacting some sort of vengeance that he can barely articulate against society itself.
And that deep, deep energy that you just can't purge, that somehow bursts to the surface at some point. I always feel that the energy of Scorpio is that profound, that powerful, and that problematic under the wrong circumstances. But Stephen, I'm very much in favor of metaphysical insight being used in the case of crime, but primarily, obviously, in the case of psychiatry, because these things are very predictable. I remember seeing a lady a while ago, and she was inquiring about somebody else, and I looked at that person's chart and said, well, I don't consider it my job to just tell you what you might want to hear or to tell you that everything's okay. That's not what I do. My job is to look at the tools I have at my disposal and give you information that you're then able to use to make change, to avert a tragedy or to embrace an opportunity. And I said to her, it's very likely that he will want to or try to commit suicide in December. And obviously she was very concerned by that, and she did a lot to get support. But sadly, it didn't work, and he did commit suicide at that exact time.
I remember
so,
when that happened.
Yeah, and I see it. You see it more and more, and it's very sad, but it reminds us each time that the tools we're working with have a very clear application to the fields of psychology or criminology, law enforcement, crime prevention. And then we're talking about global events. It has an application there to really avert huge tragedy. So I only wish that we'd been able to say to Israel a while back, you don't want to go into Gaza in July because the consequences are far worse than you can imagine. And I don't think those consequences are clear yet to the Israelis.
Well, before we go to the Middle East, I just want to look again at the stabbing chart, the event chart, to extrapolate some psychological conjecture, to use the tools that you referenced in order to grapple with the psychology of this tragedy. And so we've talked about the conjunction of the stellium in Scorpio, Saturn, Mars, and Moon in Scorpio, how it squares Mercury, Jupiter, and the Sun. But psychologically, to my thinking, Mercury would represent little Connor. Do you see? Because Mercury is a natural significator of children and young boys. And not only that, Mercury is the ruler of the 8th house. I'm sorry, the 7th house of opponents, but he's in the 8th house. This is a very significant relationship, okay? Because one of the reasons I assign Mercury as significator of Connor is because of the fact that Gemini is on the cusp of the 7th house for this 4:10 p.m. chart set for Kentwood, Michigan, the day of the stabbing. And at that time, for this particular chart, Mercury is actually posited in Leo, conjunct Jupiter and the Sun, in the 8th house. This is pretty bad for Mercury. This is a signification of death, for one thing. And not only does it rather starkly show Connor's function in this chart and say what's going to happen to him by his position in the 8th house, it also gives a little idea as to Connor's effect on Jamarion, because Mercury in Leo, the ego in this child is going to be transmitted, is going to be broadcast. And this is in no way a value judgment or a criticism of little Connor. I'm just saying that it could be that during this play session, in a totally innocent way of children, young Connor was manifesting his ego in a healthy Leonine fashion. And it triggered Jamarion. It triggered that stellium in Scorpio. And it constellated those violent and aggressive urges and tendencies on Connor Verkerko, poor fella. And it's no, I mean, it's just really, it draws the attention that we have these two planetary groupings in Scorpio and Leo square to each other. That in itself is a pretty rare configuration, Steve, to have a stellium of Mars, Saturn, and Moon in Scorpio, and also a stellium, a planetary grouping of the Sun, Mercury, and Jupiter in Leo. This doesn't happen every day. And very close to that, we have Venus in Cancer. This ties the event chart to the overall American problem of juvenile violence, of public violence in public places, because America's Venus is in Cancer, and it's fairly debilitated there. So this also pertains to the issue of the school stabbing, in the sense that Venus represents a society of consumerism, and the society that has some emotional sickness of its own. Venus in Cancer will have some emotional issues, shall we say, and that plays into the larger picture. However, let's just, every once a year, Mars is going to transit through Scorpio once roughly every year, and once a year certainly the Sun's going to transit through Leo, and all of these things had to have been heightened somehow for this particular time. There's something going on this particular summer of 2014, that's making it just a heck of a lot more violent than is usual, Steve.
Yeah, I would agree with you for sure. It's been a really horrible year in terms of world events and tragedy. I mean, even when you just look at the Middle East, take a map of the Middle East, take a map of Africa, the problems are just cropping up all over the place.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And now is probably as good a time as any to start talking about two of the more tumultuous places, two of the more dangerous places on Earth, the Ukraine and Israel. Which would you prefer to start with? Both areas are pretty hot right now.
I'd like to look at Israel first of all, Stephen. So I'll go ahead and maybe provide a little update on Israel, and then we can talk about Ukraine and Russia, because that situation is obviously still very troublesome. And I think also it's worth looking at Iraq, because the US is now conducting airstrikes. I know that Obama approved the use of air power to try and impede the Islamic State that declared itself. But I think that let's talk about Israel first of all, if that's okay.
Absolutely. They have a very interesting chart.
Yeah. So just as a reminder, Stephen, we've told people a number of times that there was a challenging eclipse in the Israeli chart. There was another one, I can't remember whether it's past or it's coming up, that was conjunct the ascendant in the Israeli chart. We said, terrible idea to go into Gaza in July, and this eclipse in question is being triggered because Mars, I think today, is at 7 degrees of Scorpio, and the eclipse trigger point, which is at the south node in the Israeli chart, is 11 degrees Scorpio. So I'm kind of holding my breath, concerned about what might happen. And I know that the ceasefire, the 72-hour ceasefire, ended, and now the US and the UN have condemned the Israeli resumption of attacks upon Gaza and the resumption of the Hamas rocket launches against Israel. So it's kicking off there again. And we talk about the need to have a sustainable ceasefire, but it just doesn't seem to be happening. And I'm just very concerned about what's likely to happen in the next week to 10 days.
Yeah, you know what, Steve? As far as I'm concerned, Israel was sort of destined from the very start to deal with some problems this year. Their solar return indicated problems.
Yes.
Their perfected ascendant also indicated problems. It's their ascendant has by now perfected to the 7th house, so they're having a 7th house perfected year, which automatically highlights diplomatic matters of diplomacy. It's the wars fall under the 7th house. In Israel's chart, the 7th house is ruled by Venus. So that makes Venus a very important time lord. It makes her a very important chronocrator for the entire year, spanning from May 14th, 2014 to May 14th, 2015. Venus will have augmented and supplemented ability and power to act during this year. And in that 2014 solar return, Venus is in Aries. 13 degrees Aries, very
conjunct Uranus, no less.
Sure. So I mean, if you do an overlay of the Israeli solar return for 2014 onto its natal figure, then the solar return ascendant falls within the natal 12th house. So that right there keys up the the 2014 as an important year. We've already talked about the Saturn and Moon configuration at 19 and 20 degrees of Scorpio. We've seen the effect that it had in Kentwood, Michigan, a place as far away as Kentwood, Michigan. Well, here's the effect that it's having in Tel Aviv, Israel, over that whole region. And again, when we cast lunar returns to do a monthly forecast, month by month for Israel, we would cast those lunar returns from this chart and not from their natal. So the moon at 20 degrees Scorpio is paradigmatic for the entire year for Israel. And to my thinking, it shows a people oriented toward revenge, both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, well, you're spot on. And in that solar return chart, Mars is right at the ascendant, so you would immediately say, well, the Israelis are going to feel in the mood for doing something. They're going to feel in the mood for taking action because Mars is right at the ascendant. And it's interesting that in the solar return chart, the 7th house is ruled by Aries. So and then also you've got Venus in Aries, as you said, conjunct Uranus in the 7th house, and the south node of the moon in the 7th house. So you pretty much, if you were providing insight, for other nations, you would say, watch out, Israel is going to be in the mood for action, and a neighbor is going to be on the receiving end, or another nation is going to be on the receiving end. So it's a very grim chart. I mean, it's got a grand cross in it, and also it has a grand trine in it between Saturn conjunct the moon in Scorpio, Jupiter in Cancer, protection of the homeland, and the part of death. There's not a lot of positives. In fact, there aren't any positives in this solar return chart.
Yeah, it's easy to forecast a hard year for Israel. There's a technique with solar return analysis where first of all, we have to look at the natal ascendant ruler. Okay, the natal ascendant is in the very beginning of Scorpio. So that makes Mars the ruler of the ascendant.
Oh, is this in the
natal chart?
Oh, well, which chart are you using for Israel? Because I've got the south node of the moon in Scorpio, but you're using whole signs, right? Right.
And also Alcibiades. There might be a slight difference between Alcibiades and Placidus.
Yes.
With the Alcibiades house system, Israel has Mars rising. And so that would make Mars the ascendant ruler. And so I would look at Mars's natal position, which is at 28 Leo. So now here's the technique, okay? I look at the solar return chart, Israel's solar return for the year, and I say, okay, where's 28 degrees Leo? Oh, it's in the 11th house. So this is what Israel's going to be. This is where their attention's going to be at this year. Diplomatic relations, allies.
Yeah, and they've got in the natal chart, Moon in Leo, Pluto in Leo, Saturn in Leo, Mars in Leo, part of death in Leo, and then they've got the rigid Taurian Sun, the nodal axis in fixed signs, and they are so heavy-handed. But don't get me wrong, Stephen, if you were launching rockets into my yard, I would have a problem with you, and I would just sit around and do nothing about it. I wouldn't sit on my terrace thinking, oh, how dreadful of Stephen to launch rockets onto my property. I'd do something about it, but I wouldn't destroy the whole neighborhood.
Well, I'll tell you what, the story of the Jews' cultivation of a state in Israel is really quite a compelling story of heroism, and it's just interesting reading. It's really, really interesting, the ingenuity that the Jews displayed against far numerically superior aggressors and opponents, and so Israel has responded with ever more ingenuity and cunning in defending itself, and indeed they have a need to defend themselves. There's a lot of people over there that hate the Jews in the Middle East. Now, and wow, as an astrologer, I absolve myself, thankfully, of the responsibility of solving the problem. I can definitely empathize with both sides, but I'm just looking at this in terms of the dynamics involved and knowing what I know about Israel, knowing what I know about Palestine and their histories, basing a judgment off of that. And with the solar return ascendant in the natal 12th house, that's a strike in the negative. That says Israel is going to be naughty this year. With the Alcibiades cusp ascendant lord in the 11th house, that says, hey, Israel is going to be smoothing over diplomatic relationships with allies this year. And lo and behold, America just green-lighted some $250 million worth of missile sales to Israel.
Yeah, because we finance the Iron Dome system. Absolutely.
So this is a very big deal to me, because what this means to me personally is that when the forces of Jerusalem go into Gaza, now I have a play in that, and I didn't want one. You know what I mean? Because America,
you're paying for it.
Right. That means whether I like it.
You bought a little chunk of a missile, Stephen.
Right. That means
it
means whether I like it or not, I'm partly responsible for what happens in Palestine. That hurts.
Yeah, you pay for a little bit of death in Palestine.
Exactly. It's irrelevant that I'm a nice guy and wouldn't do that to people. That's irrelevant. I'm still responsible for it, and we all here in America have our fraction of blame to share. And it makes me angry that I've been coerced and shanghaied into aggression against the people that have never done anything to me, that I have no beef against. You know what I'm saying? So my country's
I tell you what, though, I would happily finance a missile for ISIS.
Oh yeah, I would definitely love to take care of that problem. Succinctly, I don't know if America is saying, hey, scratch. I don't know if they're effectively just like scratching ISIS on the head and saying, come back when you know a thing or two about running a nation. In other words, I don't know if we're underestimating ISIS or were, perhaps, but now we're taking them serious.
I think we're underestimating the involvement of Westerners. People that are leaving the UK and France and the US to go and take up arms with ISIS, to go and fight in Syria and to fight in Iraq. There was an American Muslim who was photographed wearing a suicide vest.
Yes, I saw that.
Giving his life up for Allah. And there was a lady in Britain, the mother, her son had gone to fight in Syria, I think, and her comment was, "Oh yes, I've given my son to Allah. I accept that I've given my son to Allah." So this is hugely problematic for us. It's the same, Stephen, in my mind, as Ebola, a problem in Africa, is a problem for all of us, and terrorists running riot, chopping people's heads off and taking over large swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, and actually crossing the border into Lebanon. This is a global problem.
Oh, yeah,
this is a problem for us because they can get to us as well, and even if they couldn't, it's still wrong. It still needs to be addressed, and I feel relieved that Obama has now approved airstrikes, because there was something like 50,000 Christians. Now, I'm not mentioning that Christianity because it's, they're any more important than anyone else, but there were 50,000 people that happened to be Christians that were stuck up on some mountain, dying because they have no food, nowhere to go. If they tried to get away from there, they would be killed by ISIS. And we've dropped supplies, and we've opened a corridor that's safe for them by providing air coverage, I think. But yeah, it's a real problem, and it's a problem for us.
I tell you what, I mean, my heart definitely goes out to the Yazidi people who are effectively isolated and being laid siege upon by ISIS. I feel sorry for them. I identify with them. I do feel a kinship with them because they're Christians. I'm a Christian, and I feel bad for them for the humanitarian reasons, but I also feel as a Christian that we should defend the faith when it's assaulted in an egregious form like this, and we should defend the right to all people to have a freedom of religion. But even more than that, the Yazidis are descended from the Haranian Sabaeans, people who are of vital importance to the development of astrology. And not only
it's sad, isn't it, that this is part of the world.
Yes.
This is the part of the world where civilization apparently began.
The best part.
Some of our astrological forefathers thrived in that area.
Sure.
And look at it now.
It came from this place, and it went east to India, and it went west to Europe. So Iraq is where it all began for us astrologically. And the Yazidi people, they're descended from the Zoroastrian astrologers, and again the Haranian Sabaeans who had communities all throughout the Islamic world, and who were tolerated by the Muslims in the golden age of Arabic astrology, and they were tolerated by the Muslims because they were quote unquote a people of the book. You see, Zoroastrianism was considered a religion of the book, and they, in truth, these Sabaean people, they adopted Zoroastrianism only to get that people of the book status so that they could continue practicing their astrological magic. They were astrological hermetic magicians, were the Haranian Sabaeans. And the Yazidis are descended or related to people like that. So, now the Islamic State's pissing me off. You know what I'm saying? They destroyed the tomb of Jonah.
Mm-hmm.
They're worse than the Taliban. We stripped the Taliban.
Oh, they are.
So this is the problem.
And they seem to also be applauding Boko Haram in Nigeria and vice versa.
Yeah,
it's just
now this is a manifestation, Steve, of Mars and Libra, which we see in a lot of charts across the Arabic world. We see it in the chart for the Arabic mandate of the Middle East that was brokered between the Brits after the fall of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. You see, when all of these borders for all of these Arabic countries were laid out by the Brits and other European powers, you see, so the problems were started then, but they were made worse by the civil war, by the insurgency in Syria. The Islamic State is a direct result of the insurgency in Syria. We didn't address that issue in Syria when it was heating up, and instead we chose to wage warfare in what is perhaps a more cowardly way. We supported various rebel groups, and as always, as usual, our support got into the hands of the Islamic State. Weapons. I mean, can you imagine their joy when they got their hands on those? We essentially sabotaged ourselves. This is a 12th house maneuver, and I'm sure as we research the roots of this murderous clan of heathens and barbarians and goats, then we'll see this type of 12th house linkage become more clearly elucidated.
Mm-hmm. With Iraq, Stephen, going back to the astrological dynamics, again, when we talked about Iraq in our previous show, because we did do a full show on Iraq, we used the 1958 chart, July 14th, 1958, 7 a.m. Baghdad, and we felt very concerned that Mars was conjunct the south node of the moon in Aries, that cardinal fire sign, and particularly that the chart had progressed such that the south node was tightly conjunct that Mars. And then when we were looking at the transiting planets that can trigger underlying dynamics, we saw that Uranus was at 16 degrees and the south node was at 24 degrees of Aries. So in time, I'm not sure whether it's next year or the year after, probably more likely to be a year after, Uranus will reach that very, very problematic point in Iraq's chart. And again, it almost causes you to say, do you know what, I want to just shut my laptop down and put my head in my hands, because these are enormous problems.
Well,
and there are just so many of them.
Well, imagine. But let's put yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian. You know, I seriously think that it's one of the most hellish places on the earth. The Gaza Strip is about 32 square miles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
The world's biggest prison, a number of people have said.
At its widest point, it's 7.5 miles wide. At its slenderest point, 4.5, a little under 4 miles. Okay, in that space, 1.8 million people exist. 13,000 people per square mile. Can you imagine the population density? And now it's like a vast tracts of it are rubble. I mean, how on earth do you? I mean, so it's the scale of, and it's been this way for a while. You see, it's hard to imagine what life there is like, and yet they managed to eke out an existence. They have a government, and they manage to conduct governmental functions, but they're just as intractable towards this issue as Israel is. Both belligerents are extremely.
But Stephen, what makes me laugh is that the leader of Hamas has only been there once.
Yeah,
he's tucked away in Qatar, living a nice life.
You know, entities like Palestine are hard to deal with from our perspective because they've had such a checkered history, so many regime changes, so many different groups that were responsible for its administration, and this just in the past 50 years. You know, at various times, the Palestinian people were the Gaza Strip, at least, was ruled by Egypt, Israel, Britain, the Transjordanian nation, the Ottoman Turks. I can't recall in modern history when the Palestinian people have ever had any self-direction at all. So in the Israeli chart, in the chart of the nation of Israel, which includes the Palestinians, I might add, the Palestinians, because there are Palestinian Arabs who are Israeli citizens. So the Palestinian plight is absolutely woven into the Israeli natal figure. What was I saying before I rudely interrupted myself? Oh yeah, it's the nationalism for both of Israelis for Zionism and of Palestinians for their own cause is represented quite succinctly by Venus in Cancer. You know, that's sort of a general significator for nationalism, and it's during periods of significance where Venus is a Time Lord or where Venus is involved in primary directions that various nationalistic events occur for Israel. You know, but looking into the short term, next month seems to, you know, I'm sort of raising my eyebrows about that, Steve, because the perfected month is a 10th house month for Israel. And so
when you say next month, you mean September?
Well,
or
I mean,
referring to August. I find it hard to.
Yeah.
I find it hard to appreciate that we're already in August. To be honest, it seems
right.
to me like it was yesterday that I was saying, "Oh gosh, it'll be Christmas in 2 months." Hasn't this crept upon us?
Yes, from the perspective of the solar return and the perfected ascendant, the charts, these things are like New Year's anniversaries, you know, like New Year's and new months, for example. So August 14th to September 14th is next month. We're at the end of the month as far as Israel is concerned. The 14th.
Oh, okay.
You see, so we're at the end of a 9th house month, which is interesting. The 9th house is the house of God. One would expect peace during the month from July 14th to August 14th. And again, there have been efforts made toward peace. There have been several ceasefires. Not so next month, because next month corresponds with the 10th house for the perfected month, August 14th to September 14th. And the 10th house in the Israeli natal figure has both malefics and Leo. So one might reasonably expect resumption of hostilities. And again, as that perfected ascendant moves over each body, it'll produce an event in accordance to the body that it moves across. I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about any real astronomical transit. This is a mathematical manipulation that we're doing to the circle itself. This is a permutation that we're doing just using pure math. We're essentially permutating the houses of the Israeli natal figure, rotating them at a certain rate, rotating certain special significators like the ascendant at a certain rate for the year, for the month. Okay, and by doing that, the ascendant is going to move across the moon, Pluto, Saturn, and Mars in that 10th house month in August. So, do
your analyses concur with mine that we're on the cusp of a significant problem that affects Israel?
Yes.
That then causes Israel to further react.
Yes.
To Palestine and Hamas, because really, if you look at I know that some members of the Israeli armed forces have been killed in the military action, and a lot of a ridiculous number of Hamas rockets have been fired at Israel. But let's face it, the vast majority of impact has been upon the Palestinian people, the Gazan people. I mean, people that have ventured out of these schools and hospitals to return to their homes to find that their home is gone. And it's not just some people, it's many people. Their homes have just been obliterated. So the Palestinians, the Gazans have been on the receiving end. There's been far more impact there. But my analysis says that there's going to be a significant impact for Israel shortly. And goodness knows how the Israelis will react to that. So my question to you is, does your analysis, because you and I use some different tools to gather our insight, so my question is, does your analysis suggest that Israel is about to be on the receiving end of something?
Yes, it does. That's one thing I like about the Alcibiades house system is, I like the idea of the natal ascendant being in the early degrees of Scorpio, because that, as far as I'm concerned, encapsulates the cycle of violence and vengeance that fuels this Arab-Israeli conflict. Having the ascendant in Scorpio like that says that the entity described by the horoscope is going to be both the recipient and the agent of a Martian force. And that's turned out to be true. But of course, using another system such as Placidus having an ascendant in Libra also seems pertinent as well. It also seems cogent. We ran into the same issue with Jeffrey Dahmer, ironically enough.
Did we?
Yeah, we did. But
wasn't he our first show?
Yeah, he certainly was. I mean, I don't know what that has to do with Israel, but as far as the general significator for butchery and murder, perhaps then I suppose it fits. But my prognosis does indeed agree with yours, because I'm thinking 2015 will also be troublesome for Israel, because the perfected ascendant will be in the 8th house, so instead of having a 7th house year, Israel will be having an 8th house year, and 8th house symbolism is fairly obvious. It represents anxiety and worry. It also represents a scramble for trade and investment and finances. These wars are going to be expensive. The Iron Dome, it's not cheap.
Hey, Stephen, you know that on Sunday we have a full moon that's a supermoon.
Ah.
And if you pull the Israeli chart for Sunday, just to consider where that supermoon is.
Right.
On Sunday, Mars is within 2 degrees of the south node, that eclipse point in Israel's chart, and the full moon, supermoon in Aquarius at 19 degrees is in opposition to Saturn in the Israeli chart, and also the supermoon will square transiting Saturn for all of us. So that's not good.
I think
that's astrological speak for oh shit, that's not good.
Is that a technical term?
Yeah.
Not good.
Damn.
Yeah, the situation is really kind of dire. I'm wondering if sort of the rash of eclipses we had back in the spring, I'm wondering if that eclipse, if we might not be feeling sort of the delayed effects of that. What do you think, Steve?
Well, they get triggered, don't they, by a transiting planet? I always describe the eclipses in this way. They hypercharge a point in the chart. So they hypercharge a point in every entity. But obviously, we're each different entities. So whatever it stimulates in my chart, it could be something very different that is stimulated in your chart. In my chart, it could be stimulating an already prominent or powerful point in the chart. In your chart, it might not be. It might be in a weak house where there's no planet and it doesn't form any particularly intense aspect to other parts of your chart. So you're not going to feel a huge or significant impact, whereas I might. And then that supercharged spot in the chart sort of sits there, hyper activated, and then you get a transiting planet that moves in, and then when it crosses that point, it triggers that energy. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Israel, because the supercharged point was the south node of the moon in the first house in Scorpio in the Israeli chart, and it's being activated by Mars this Sunday and then for several days after that. But also we've got that supermoon, which is going to oppose natal Saturn in the Israeli chart, and it squares transiting Saturn. But also at the same time, you see, with the transiting nodal axis on the ascendant and descendant of the Israeli chart, which suggests also that there's some impact upon Israel. Again, complicated way of saying not good.
Yeah, the 2015 solar return also looks fairly challenging, because the natal ascendant ruler is in the 8th house of death. We have the 8th house symbolism, it seems, just to be accentuated for 2015, but it remains to be seen about August for sure. I agree with you about the sinister implications of Mars coming to transit the eclipse position, the eclipse degree, and the south node degree. I think that is going to be significant. Certainly times out with some of the other negative omens that we've talked about in terms of the profected ascendant coming to the 10th house for the month of August 14th to September 14th. And really, considering that that perfecting ascendant is going to first hit the moon in Leo, we might expect some issue involving the people, some public outcry, or perhaps some public demand for violence. This is followed by the Pluto and Saturn combo, and that seems to me fairly obvious. Saturn in Leo is going to reject war. To me, I'm reading that as a radical, big outcry, probably resulting from some atrocity. Let's not forget, we have transiting Jupiter going through Leo as well, do you see? And transiting Jupiter is going to encounter that stellium of malefics in Israel's natal 10th house in Leo. So sure, yeah, we're looking at a long-term conflict here that might be periodic, cessuras, periodic ceasefires as we've seen, but I don't expect the situation to improve. Looking into 2015, that is definitely not.
And there is a connection between all of these terrorist organizations. I don't believe for a minute that Boko Haram, Hamas, and ISIS are operating completely independently.
No.
There has to be interaction. I mean, the there was an announcement, a statement, by the Caliphate that. Oh, here we go. There's There's a statement here I found about Hamas. Hamas has been looking forward to implement Allah's promise, whatever time it may take, etc., etc. And there are comments by Boko Haram and also by ISIS. So I always say I'm not in favor of Hamas in any way. I'm in favor of the Palestinian people that are suffering, but Hamas is a terrorist organization. And also I think we've got to bear in mind that Israel is increasingly surrounded by terrorists. And I think that the action that they've taken is going to make a lot of people determined to get revenge. And I think that the dynamics we're seeing astrologically and what you were just describing there confirm that there's going to be a price to pay. Israel is going to pay a price for so aggressively going after Gaza.
Oh yeah, I mean, in the 2014 solar return, the cause of the war is shown by Mercury in the 8th house. You know, teenagers that are in the house of death. Mercury representing teenagers. And so that was just a flashpoint of tensions that had been escalating, certainly. And unfortunately, doesn't look like it's going anywhere. You know, Hamas is in charge of the Palestinian government, if I'm not mistaken. And this is what makes the situation complex. Hamas is the ruling body of the Palestinian political apparatus, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So this makes them not only a terrorist organization, it makes them head of state of the Palestinian people. However,
and it's really the Palestinian people are being held hostage by Hamas. Listen to this statement here, Stephen. This is a statement. As America, it's on the CNN's website. As Americans and Europeans beg for ceasefires, it's useful to see Hamas's attitude towards such arrangements. From Article 13, peaceful solutions initiatives and international conferences. So this is a statement. Peace initiatives, the so-called peaceful solutions and the international conferences to resolve the Palestinian problem are all contrary to the beliefs of the Islamic resistance movement, for renouncing any part of Palestine means renouncing part of the religion. The movement educates its members to adhere to its principles and to raise the banner of Allah over their homeland as they fight their jihad. There is no solution to the Palestinian problem except by jihad, it concludes. The initiative's proposals and international conferences are but a waste of time, an exercise of futility. The Palestinian people are too noble to have their future, their rights, their destiny submitted to a vain game. But again, what's tragic about this is that these are not the words of the Palestinian people, these are the words of Hamas.
It falls back to the concept of nationalism in reference to the natal symbol of Venus in Cancer. In the 2015 return, Venus has a return year. Also, in addition to the Sun, she returns to Cancer as well. And so she's highlighted in the 7th house in the solar return. This again brings a focus on not only the 7th house, but the 8th house this time. That's one reason why I expect the hostilities to continue. And it's very interesting, when I looked at the chart for the Islamic State, formerly known as ISIS, I was shocked. I was like, man, if I didn't know any better, it looks to me like America supporting ISIS. I was shocked by the number of significant contacts between sensitive American degree areas in the Sibley chart and the chart for the ISIS for the Islamic State, and it makes me remember.
There are conspiracy theorists that say there is a deliberate attempt to create war in the Middle East.
Well, that's not what I'm thinking is if it's possible for kids from the UK and America and other places to travel to Syria and join the Islamic State, how much easier would it be to wire their money? Not only them, but also Boko Haram, also any other terrorist group. So to my thinking, it's really, a lot of funding is probably coming from American donors. We see this pattern replicated with Israel. Israel receives a lot of donations both from Jews living in America and also from fundamentalist Christians living in America as well. They support Israel to the tune probably almost as much as the American government does.
Well, listen to this. This is another statement by another Hamas statement. Our doctrine in fighting you, the Jews, is that we will totally exterminate you. We will not leave a single one of you alive because you are alien usurpers of the land and eternal mercenaries. And then Boko Haram, a spokesman for Boko Haram, recently said, the Nigerian state and Christians are our enemies, and we will be launching attacks on the Nigerian state and its security apparatus, as well as churches, until we achieve our goal of establishing an Islamic state in place of the secular state. And this is crazy. This is the world gone mad.
Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on Boko Haram as well. I read some news items where they kidnapped the son of a chieftain, and also Somalia with Al-Shabaab. So there's a smattering of insurgent groups and radical Islamists across northern Africa, even into southern and sub-Saharan areas across the Middle East. Now, this is important to America, not only just for reasons of having peace in the area, but also for geopolitical advantage and stability. Now, the Middle East is a vital, not only is it vital for its energy resources, but it's also vital for access to the former Soviet satellite states in Central Asia, like Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan and places like that. These are strategically important areas because they border Russia. You see, we've got a good spot over in the east with an ally in Japan and with bases in South Korea. What we need is representation. We need security in Russia's southwestern area, the Crimea, the Middle East, that region. And also we're going to need it in the Ukraine, too, and that area is falling apart. But we're going to have to visit Ukraine, I think, next week or at some other point.
One other thought, Stephen, is it would be great if we find a chart for Hamas, to have a look at a chart for Hamas. We haven't done that, have we?
No, we haven't. That'll probably require a little bit of research, but it shouldn't be too difficult. Probably some enterprising soul has already done it, and we'll have that ready by next week, I'm sure. Shouldn't be too hard. So.
I wonder when the discussion about Yitzhak Rabin will crop up as well.
What, when we talk about him?
Well, when it will hit the press again. And then also Arafat, and because there's still this mystery about how Arafat died, and there doesn't seem to be much discussion about Arafat's death. And it's only a matter of time before that information springs up and is used politically.
Maybe it might, because I'll tell you something. What was the other Russian spy who defected to Britain?
I can never remember his name, but the British have announced that they're doing a full investigation.
Yeah, he recently made the news.
Yeah. It's just after the Russian provocations that all of a sudden the British announced that they decided they were going to do a full investigation into that. And that really stinks, because that should have been, that was a no-brainer. Of course it should be investigated. But it was politically motivated, because it was sticking the finger up to Russia and Putin, basically.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me at all if it comes out later that Arafat was poisoned by the Mossad or something like that, because
I'm sure he was.
A, Israel's 12th house is accentuated natally. B, it's tied very closely to the Saturn-Neptune cycle. It's important to the 12th house as well. So that makes me think they're long-term espionage projects.
Sure.
So it'll be interesting. We're going to have to get into the area of cloak and dagger stuff, maybe scare up some charts for the CIA and things like that, and talk about them at some point in the future. But actually, unfortunately, we're running out of time now. I'd like to thank our approximately 6.5 billion listeners out there for tuning in, and Steve, I'd like to thank you for joining us and sharing all of your awesome insights. Everybody, you can find Steve at StephenFrampton.com. Pick up a copy of his book, Thinking Completely Outside the Box. And you can find me at thegingerpsychic.com. Shoot us an email. Pretty soon we'll probably get back into doing some natal analyses at some point. But it's just been such a morbid summer, we haven't gotten around to it. You got anything, Steve?
No, just encourage people to visit your site, Stephen, and to book a consultation with you. I've had one, and it was incredibly powerful and accurate, useful, and just really enjoyed the show. I'll look forward to the show next week.
As do I. Have a great week, everyone. Cheers.